Welcome to A Stranger, a Suitcase and a Story. I'm Anton van der Walt. This is a podcast about starting over. It is about what it takes to leave the familiar behind and the courage it takes to begin again in a land that isn't yet home. Together with my co-host Ben Liebenberg, we explore the untold stories of migration. Not just where people went, but why they left, what they held on to, and what they've had to let go. Each episode, we sit down with someone who's made that leap. Someone who's left behind not just places, but languages, careers, communities, and sometimes even parts of themselves. They share what called them forward, what nearly held them back, and what they've come to understand about identity, belonging, and starting again. Produced in partnership with Southern Crossings, a community for South Africans forging new lives in Australia, this podcast is a place to feel seen, heard, and understood. Because this isn't just about visas or paperwork. It's about identity, loss, hope, and the quiet strength it takes to rebuild a life piece by piece. So wherever you are on your journey, arriving, settling, or still thinking about it, welcome. This is where stories connect us all.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This information to customers travelling on the Land Airways flight LA 800 question 321 service to Auckland and Santiago.
Welcome to another episode of A Stranger, a Suitcase and a Story. I'm Anton van der Walt, and with me is my co-host, Ben Liebenberg. How are you, Ben?
Good, Anton, self.
I'm doing very well, thank you. I'm just so excited to introduce our guest a little later. But, Ben, I saw a really great article the other day. It was a small snippet of something, and then I went to do a little bit of a study on it, and it was just something quite incredible that I want to, before I introduce our guest, maybe just talk a little bit about a lady called Caroline Chisholm. Now, Caroline Chisholm was one of Australia's earliest and most remarkable advocates of immigrants, a woman who believed that families, not just individuals, were the heart of successful settlement. So she was born in England in 1808, and she arrived in Sydney in 1838 and was struck by the hardship of new arrivals faced. Families torn apart, young women vulnerable, or children left behind in England, and people had crossed oceans to find uncertainty waiting for them. She didn't look away. She acted, and in 1842 in Maitland, and that's really what caught my eye, Ben. This is our valley. In Maitland, New South Wales, she rented a pair of cottages and turned them into a hostel for newly arrived migrants seeking work in the Hunter Valley, offering shelter, meals, and the chance to get on their feet. That small sandstone cottage is on Mill Street is one of the few surviving buildings of its time, a rare witness to the early struggles of immigrants in the Hunter. Today it stands not just as a stone and mortar, but as a memory honoured by the very first blue plaque in New South Wales. And these plaques mark the places where history lives, places where stories are etched into our collective memory. But Caroline's vision stretched far beyond temporary lodging. She believed that the true key to settlement was giving families land, farms they could work, communities that they could grow, and roots that they could plant in Australian soil. And to her, belonging was more than survival. It was the dignity of building a life with stability and hope. And so when she returned to England in 1846, she carried with her the voices of those who she helped. So she gathered more than 600 letters from settlers, words written by pioneers meant to guide those who would follow. She fought to reunite families, arranging for children left behind to join parents, and helping wives to emigrate and rejoin husbands, many of them who were former convicts. And as she also founded the Family Colonization Loan Society to make affordable passage possible for households, whole households, not just individuals, And 8 years later, she came back to Australia, settling in Sydney and Melbourne, and once again threw herself into reform. She gave lectures, wrote stories like Little Joe, and campaigned for fairer opportunities for working families, always driven by the belief that migration only works when families are whole. So, Ben, that in many ways is what we're trying to do here, in a much smaller way, of course. This podcast continues her work in the sense that we're collecting stories from those who have already made the journey so that others might find guidance, encouragement, or simply knowledge that they're not alone. I think that, Ben, this is what we see so often when we speak to people.
And actually thinking back on when we started, I don't want to even start comparing us with that lady. She's remarkable, but when we just sat and over a red wine one night and decided we're going to do this spot, this is exactly what we said to each other, like, this is what we want to achieve. And even if we help one or two people and, make it easier for them, then it's been worthwhile.
Yeah, I think so. And when I read the story, I was struck. I mean, there's so much more to it, but I think that it always takes somebody special to do something like this and to be an advocate. And then the more that we do these podcasts, the more interesting people we get. So nothing less than our guest for tonight, Ben, is our guest, which I'm going to introduce now, is Mark Stanbridge. Now, Mark grew up in Bloemfontein. And Mark, this is something that you don't know. I was born in Bloemfontein myself.
Fantastic.
Family, both English and Afrikaans traditions, and through his mother's family, is related to Bram Fischer, the anti-apartheid lawyer who famously defended Nelson Mandela in the Rivonia trial. So through this relation, he was exposed early on to the complexities of South African society and politics. I think that's putting it very mildly, I'm sure. Yeah. After a Rotary exchange to Casino, New South Wales in 1978, and an Abe Bailey bursary to the UK, Mark's path became one of global exposure. He did not complete compulsory military service by spending time in the UK and then returning during South Africa's turbulent early 1990s. In 1993, he co-managed Muhammad Ali's South African tour before facing a choice: pursue politics with the ANC in 1994 or emigrate. With his soon-to-be wife set on Australia, they chose Sydney. Figures, right? So requalify as a lawyer in a system tough on South Africans at the time, while working full-time, building a new life, tested his resilience. And with support from fellow experts, he rose to become a senior partner in Ashurst, leading corporate transactions across Asia and Australia and gaining recognition as one of the country's top merger and acquisition lawyers. Today, his story stretches across Bloemfontein, London, Durban, and Sydney, reflecting a career shaped by cultural contrast and international deal-making. Beyond law, he's contributed to the Australian Rhino Project. We're really interested to hear about that, Mark, and the Australian Chamber Orchestra and other community causes. And through it all, he carries two things from home: his liberal values and the family dining snooker table that has become a metaphor for many of his life's negotiations. Yeah. So, Mark, welcome to the podcast. Really stoked to have you here.
Wonderful. Thank you. I much appreciate being here.
Yeah. Yeah, we are. So I've now spoken a lot, Ben. I think that what I think will be really interesting for us is to start there at the beginning.
Yeah, so many questions, But yeah, we always start, Mark, finding out a little bit about Bloemfontein, how you grew up, What was life like for young Mark?
Well, it was fantastic. Bloemfontein's still a place very close to my heart. It's where I grew up. I grew up on a beautiful farm just outside Bloemfontein on the Soutpan Pot, and we had 120 acres there, and we grew chickens, and we had cattle, and we had sheep, and we had pigs, and we had pigeons, and we had bantam cocks, and we had peacocks, and so we had a pretty idyllic life. We ran around barefoot, and we shopped with our catties and our pellet guns, and we played golf, and we played cricket, and we swam, and we played tennis. And strangely enough, and maybe it's a bit early in the podcast to raise this, but we played happily with the young black kids who were on the farm. I was about 5 years old or so when we moved out there, and we didn't even notice race at that age. We played happily with them. And it was only a year later when we sort of suddenly realized they went to school at one place and we went to school at another place, that you start sort of picking up on these things and becoming sort of sensitive to them. In that time. Bloemfontein was an interesting place. It It was a city which was quite Afrikaans at that stage. It had been quite English, during the sort of the Anglo-Boer type periods, but it was quite Afrikaans, but it had a very strong English heritage. There were a lot of foreigners who lived there, people who came out after the Second World War, and particularly Italians and Greeks and Portuguese people. My mum's family is a mixture of the Fichard family, Afrikaans family, and an Italian family, the Quadros. So I've got that on one side, and on the other side, I've got English on my father's side, English and a bit of Irish as well, So, that sort of, that kind of mixed piece. And so for us as immigrants coming to Australia, there were a whole lot of people who had come from a range of places over a long period that sort of formed the background within my familial connections from all over the world. But, it was an interesting place to grow up in. It was conservative. My father was an architect. My mother and father had various businesses. My mother worked. She was a great mother, but she ran our farm and she ran my father's businesses. She did all the books, and we had apartment blocks and property investments, and it was a good place to live. But, it had all the strictures of South Africa from very early on in my life. I went to St. Andrew's School in Bloemfontein, which was a private boys' Anglican school. At that time, very small school, 450 guys from sub-A to matric. So over 12 years, my matric class had 18 guys in it. So it was a very small school. We had to compete against Grey College and Kepler Vessels at cricket. Our cricket team was one of those where the captain said to you, Mark, you can bowl next, and Kepler Vessels was batting. You'd say, no, thanks. I think I'll sit out another couple of overs. And you could give the ball to someone else. Yeah. But, they were wonderful times. They were wonderful times within the strictures of South Africa and apartheid. But that's real life. You can't avoid those realities, to be honest.
Yeah. So was that something like you mentioned it a bit earlier? And I'm curious to ask, because I don't think intuitively I really thought about it that much than other people. It's only when I got a bit older that I really clicked on that something. I just thought that's a normal. I never really questioned it too much. Were you one of those people who always intuitively thought about the whole apartheid thing and questioned it, or was it something that came through your folks? Or
yeah, absolutely, it came through my parents. There's always that nature-nurture piece, and people always claim intuition, but I think a lot of it is your socialization, how you brought up. I had parents who were, my parents were very news-oriented. My father read prolifically. He read even the small adverts at the back of the Friend newspaper and the Volksblad, and the Sunday Times and the Sunday Tribune and, the Star and the Time magazine and the Economist, and, he read everything. And, these were days pre-TV, okay? So we had the SABC. So, there wasn't a lot of unvarnished news, if you know what I mean. But we had that fundamental kind of, I suppose, liberal, small L liberal underpinning in our family. And my mother's family, had the kind of Bram Fisher side. He was my grandfather's first cousin, my mother's second cousin. He was there, and that family, the Fichards, are a fascinating family because, some of them sort of went Roy, sort of the more liberal side, and the others remained more conservative. My godfather was Ewald Fichard, who ultimately became the mayor of Bloemfontein. And so those strictures were sort of very prominent in my life from an early on, almost as far back as I can remember. And, and I mentioned that one example about the young guys and girls we played with on the farm, in our bare feet. It was there. But I suspect it came out of the way I was brought up and it been explained to us. In Bloemfontein, we still had the siren that went off at 9:15 and then at 9 o'clock again, and all black people had to be off the street. And if they weren't, they were arrested. So that piece around people's treatment because of their color and what rights and obligations they had was very clear to me from early on. And I still think about it growing up on a farm, and we had black people living in strooise, mud huts basically, without electricity, without reticulated water, with a long drop blue, getting a bag of meal, half a sheep every 2 weeks, whatever it may be. I mean, a very, very different existence from what I had growing up in a very large house with a very large garden and a lot of land around us, with a lot of well-educated, well-off neighbours.
Well, I grew up in the Western Cape, and then pretty much there at Paul, the world stops at the mountain there, you don't think any further than that. But I was quite shocked when I grew older, and I learned that and help me if I'm wrong here, but there was a law that if you're not non-white, you can't stay over the night. You have to travel through. Was that true?
In the Free State, no, that was Indians.
Oh, that Indians. Okay. All right.
To give you some indication how that worked, so Indians could transit through the Free State, Orange Free State in those days. They couldn't be in the Free State for more than 24 hours. And I can remember two very funny incidents. One was when I was at university and I was a little older. I had an Indian friend at university who, wanted to come and stay overnight. And my parents were happy about that. They didn't have an issue with that. He then found out that he had to transit through within 24 hours, and so he refused to stay overnight. He just drove through Free State. He wasn't going to stay. He ended up being quite politically involved. He ended up being quite a senior bureaucrat post 1994. He's an impressive guy, but he just wasn't prepared to kind of take that risk on a petty thing like that. The other thing I remember is going on a school sports tour, and we used to go to Johannesburg a lot and sometimes down to Cape, but generally Joburg, and we'd play St. Stithians and St. John's and Kes and St. Albans in Pretoria, etc. And we were on the station and the train came through from Cape Town to Durban. And you remember there were all the carriages for white people, carriages for black people, carriages for colored people, carriages for Indian people. And out of the window were leaning Indians, because there were no Indians in the Free State. And they were leaning out the windows, and these black kids pointing and roaring with laughter because hadn't seen Indians before and they hadn't seen black people with long black hair. It was kind of really, and it sort of sticks with me because, you think about those things now, they sound so bizarre, but they were very real, growing up in that kind of environment.
It's amazing. I think about that too, because, we're all kind of similar ages, Mark.
Yes.
And so we grew up in different pockets in South Africa. I grew up I was born in Bloemfontein, but we left when I was 2 years old, and then ended up in Randburg, in Johannesburg. And again, it was a pocket, and you went to school there, to the primary school and then to the senior school, and that's where you were, and that's all you saw. So you just grow up and think it's all natural. And then, the thing that changed a lot for me was when I went to the army, and I suddenly saw there's a different world, because first of all, there was a group of white people that you didn't know existed, because you now grow up in Randburg. It's a middle class family, and suddenly you dumped into a situation where there was any class. You suddenly and so it's also, I would imagine, it's a function of where it's so different today, because we have such access to technology, that something like that would never be able to happen ever again.
Absolutely.
And I think
Totally agreed.
in the communication and making sure things don't go out or don't go out of pockets was then easy to do, because there was no other way of doing it. There was, as you say, there was the SABC. Yeah, so it's very interesting. And I think the other thing that I'm hearing you say, which I resonate with that a lot, is that how you become as an adult. And the way that you think, the things that you do, the way you see the world has got so much to do with how you get brought up by your parents in terms of their views of the world.
Yeah.
So you saw that in South Africa too. If the view remained conservative through all the years, then the kids most often are like that too, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Look, your upbringing is really important. You can either go the same kind of way as your upbringing, or you can actually reject it and go a different path. And, I've seen that quite a lot with people who come from terribly conservative backgrounds. If you think of Pik Botha's son being such a different human being from him.
That's right.
True. Verwoerd's son, if I've got it correct, I think it's a son. Very different political views grandson, sorry, from Verwoerd. So, these things can go in different, in different kind of routes, and that's ROUTS. Yeah,
that's right. So Bloemfontein was, or probably still is, the legislative capital of South Africa, right?
The judicial.
Or judicial.
So the Supreme Court of Appeals there.
Yeah. So did that have any influence in you thinking you want to become a lawyer? Was that something else?
Well, that's the other thing, how the world's changed. When I was growing up in Bloemfontein, we did an aptitude test at St. Andrews, and we then had a careers night, and there was a doctor, a dentist, an accountant, a lawyer, an architect. It was kind of simple. There weren't even stockbrokers in Bloemfontein or people in financial services or any of that. So you had a choice of, you're going to farm, If you were intelligent enough, you weren't joining the railways, you weren't joining the Free State Provincial Administration as a bureaucrat, and if you wanted to go to universities, you're going to do one of those white-collar professions. And then the choice was, did you go to Free State, Varsity, Korfsies, or did you go to Natal or Cape Town or Pretoria or Wits or whatever it may be? And those are the choices you kind of had to make.
Yeah.
It was kind of a lot simpler than it is today. I was at dinner with my 23-year-old daughter, whose birthday it is today, last night. And, we're talking about careers in the last few weeks, and she's trying to kind of make her way in the new AI world. And she's studying anthropology, and where does she go? She wants to make a decent living. She's artistic, and she's not full of avarice to make a hell of a lot of money, but she wants to live comfortably. Where does she go? And I think it's very difficult for people, even with our backgrounds, to advise a 23-year-old what their paths should be in the modern world, because it's just so much more complicated than it was for us in Bloem. Things were kind of quite simple. They were sort of binary in many ways when we were growing up, which I think in a way made life easier, perhaps not as rich, perhaps not, but it had a simplicity about it which was quite amazing. Just thinking about our farm, we had a large farm. We had, I think, something like 13 or 14 outside doors. We'd go on holiday. We never locked that house, ever, not once. We didn't even have keys for the doors. We didn't lock them at night. No, we used to go on holiday down to South Broome on the Natal South Coast, or to the Eastern Transvaal, or wherever we went, and we never locked the house, ever.
Good.
It's just
good
a
old
different
days.
time. Just a different. Well, I don't know if it's good old days.
Well,
I
from
try
a
not to
security
kind of
point of
look at
view.
it that. Yeah, absolutely from a security
point
perspective,
of view. But I've told this story before because interesting. Anton and I is recently on our pod. We've actually had quite a few younger people coming through. Early 30s, professionals, that kind of thing. And Anton asked the same questions. How did you end up doing it? And I've told the story, and a lot of them actually said the same that happened to me, is that I was at school and I didn't know what to do, and everybody said to me, well, go to the army. You're really mature there, so you'll find your feet, you'll come out, you know what you want to do. So I went to the army, and I came out of the army, and then I knew less what I wanted to do. I was more confused than I when I went in.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So then I decided I'm going to do what my dad did. So, it's interesting if you actually go and look at it, that so many people just don't really know, and then ultimately they make a decision because of what their parents did or what they used to or what they know. And I've got a lot of friends who's doctors, and I speak to them as well and say, well, do you always wanted to be a doctor, help people? And they said, no, not really. My parents did it, so I thought, I might as well go and do it as well.
Yeah, look, lawyers were very omnipresent in my life. My parents had a lot of lawyer friends. There's law kind of in my mother's side of the family. We knew a lot of judges. One of the appellate court judges, Henny van Heerden, lived 2 doors down from us when we still lived in Bloemfontein in Marquard Crescent, where the famous Marquard family come from Bloemfontein, as you know, Leo Marquard, that whole family. And some of their children now, Jane Marquard's just been appointed to the Federal Court Division 2 bench in Australia. Remarkable families that come out of Bloemfontein. But I think, part of the motivation around law was human rights and fighting for the downtrodden. That's not where I ended up, and there are very good reasons why I didn't end up there. But, that was kind of the stuff that stimulated me when I was a young person.
Yeah. So tell us more about
fighting
that.
for those sorts of rights.
Yeah, tell us more about your young life then. So we've skipped quite a bit, but so you grew up in Bloemfontein, you had school there. What are the kind of things that you enjoyed at school? Were you always quite academic?
I played a lot of sport. I played a lot of sport. I debated a lot. Our school was a very musical school. There was a strong choir. There was a band. There was a St. Andrews Singers. And the guy eventually ran the Drakensberg Boys Choir, was our music teacher.
Wow.
Okay.
The whole school revolved around music and singing, and it had a religious background, but, you didn't have to be religious. We had people of all different denominations at the school. It was a school just where there was a lot of music. It was a school where there were a lot of liberally oriented teachers. Roger Crawford, who passed away unfortunately recently, he was the person who led the Sullivan Code in South Africa with American companies to deal with the downtrodden, the oppressed in South Africa in a more appropriate way. This is pre-sanctions. We had people like him. We had Priest and his wife. who were remarkable people, and a number of other teachers who were very liberally inclined. The Free State rugby captain, Daan de Wet, was an Afrikaans teacher of ours. And, so we had this real mix of people that sort of stimulated us. And there were people who evoked in me, because I can only talk for myself, curiosity and understanding. And they used to take us to stuff, and we used to get taken to political things and listen to debates and a couple of really funny. My mother was at home one night, and it was pre-mobile phone days, of course, and I think we'd just come off a party line on our farm, and the phone rang, and my mother answered it, and this voice said, "I want to speak to Mark Stanbridge," and said, "Well, he's not here at the moment, he's at school." And she said, "May I say who's calling?" He said, "It's Dr. Frederick van Zyl-Slabbert." And my mother said, "Yes." What? He said, "Well, Mark's signed up to work with the Progressive Party, who were running a candidate in Bloemfontein, Peter Price. I think he got about 12 votes, but, we were running it, and I was helping to canvass. I was 13 years old. So at a kind of a very young age, I had a kind of a sense of this. And my grandmother who was, married to my grandfather, the mother of my mother, she was very involved in the United Party in Natal. Right. And when I used to go on holiday there, she always took me to the political meetings and that. And I loved it. Okay. I loved the chatter and the debate and people arguing with each other. And, it was all pretty good sport. And I kind of got a lot of stimulation out of that. All right. And even Bloemfontein had that. I can remember going with a friend of my sister's who was a reporter at The Friend, and Andries Treenicht was speaking in the Bloemfontein City Hall. I would have been at university at that stage. And Dr. Treenicht came in, and he started speaking and got to the end, and we had to stand to sing Die Stem. And I never stood to sing Die Stem. Okay, it was just one of my little personal things. And I was sitting, and she was sitting next to me, and this big guy behind me sort of picked me up by my shoulders and said, "Staan op, boetie, staan op, boetie." And I said, "Nee, ek staan nie op nie." And they say, "Ek gaan jou bliksem." And I said to Nikki, "Run." And she and I ran out of the door. I don't know if you know the city hall in Bloem, it's got these passages down the sides. They're quite wide, where you could egress very easily. And the two of us were sprinting like hell out of the Bloemfontein City Hall. So we never saw the end of that, of that particular meeting. So I always had that sort of cheeky political thing that I think came out of my experiences in Bloemfontein and experiences with my grandmother, to be honest.
Yeah. But so were you a day scholar or boarding school?
No, I was a day boy, and then we all went to boarding school in Standard 8, year 10 equivalent. So, I think my parents believed we only lived by bicycle about 25 minutes from school. But we still went to boarding school because all the societies and all the extramural stuff occurred at night. Because we had school in the morning and then chapel first every morning, except Saturdays, twice on Sundays. We had school, and then we had sport every afternoon until 5. And then we had shower, dinner, prep time, and then extramural societies at 8:30 or whatever it was at night. And that's the way you could get the sort of exposure to the debating society and the photographic society and the current affairs society and all these other things, which was wonderful. It was a very rich educational experience in a very small, rather poor private school.
I do want to ask you, because it's interesting. I think we grew up probably similar age than you, so we can understand it, but especially for the younger guys maybe, and Australians listening to the pod as well, it might seem that, you just, didn't go with the flow, but it couldn't have been easy in those days. I mean, you were totally the minority. It must have been, you must have got a lot of flack and opposition, and just, that's just what I think. Maybe it wasn't that difficult, but I just think it must have been difficult.
Yeah. At times it was depleting, to be quite honest. We had a beautiful log cabin on our farm. We had a very pretty farm, which Dr. Krause of the famous Krause family of the Free State built. And we had dams, and below it he had dug tunnels. He was an engineer, and there were pits. And it was a very intricate system. So our dam used to fill and empty within a very short period, and all the water was stored underground in these tunnels. Okay, it was kind of a fairly remarkable kind of thing. But he built this beautiful farm, and there was a log cabin, a proper old log cabin. And the Rotary Club and the Lions Club and all sorts of people used it for functions and for fundraisers and various things. And the then Progressive Party, there was Helen Suzman was very sort of prominent, asked if they could use it. And my father said, of course they can. And as I mentioned, my dad was an architect, and, he couldn't be fussy because it wasn't going to be sufficient private work for him to do. So he designed schools and hospitals around the Free State, all paid for by the provincial administration. And after he had that function there, he got phoned by a friend of his in the department who said to him in Afrikaans, "John, you need to understand that the fact that you've had the Progressive Party there has been noticed, and I just advise you don't have another one of those. You've got to be very, very careful because it could turn the tap off of your workflow." Okay.
Yep.
So these are sorts of things that happened, when I was involved in NUSAS and that at university, and I was the SRC president. My parents got very threatening letters. I had a younger sister. There was a threatening letter about what happened to her. Our brake lining was cut in my motor car. And that put a lot of pressure on my parents because whilst they understood where I was coming from, they were the ones at risk because I was putting my head above the parapet. So look, it was terrifying. We Peter Maritzburg, we filled the Maritzburg City Hall with university students when the RV Beer came to town and De Blanche was on his horse, and we filled it. And what we did was, as he started speaking, and it was like a sort of a Nuremberg rally, okay, a light with these sort of eagles behind him and these guys in uniforms, and we just got up and we all had a clock, and we got up and we walked out one by one every 20 seconds. Okay.
Oh, really?
So by so many minutes in, the front 2/3 of the hall was totally empty.
Okay.
And he got benieuwd and they got benieuwd across. And they chased us outside and confronted us. And, there were a few slaps and punches thrown and that. So there was absolutely that kind of, that threatening stuff, And, the security police were an omnipresent piece. But, I never kind of suffered under them. A lot of my friends suffered terribly. And those are white people. Black people, suffered more. Indian people suffered, coloreds. So it was around, and of course you were scared. Of course it made you fearful. I mean, you'd be inhuman not to feel that. But, you had to be brave because it was important to be brave. And you didn't want to be seen to be a coward on those things.
Well, I mean, you had the Stano Buti when you were 13, so...
No, I was a bit older then. I was at university at the Stano Buti stage, yeah.
But that's just what you lived with, right?
I would have run faster at 13, I can assure you.
No, I mean, I take my hat off, and it takes something special to do that, and then, of course, to persist, right? It was easy, obviously, to say, well, this is just too hard, right?
Yeah, it is. But, I was never sort of one for conforming. And, I think it's one of the reasons I didn't go to the army, because I would have had a terrible time. Okay. I mean, I had an ethical problem with it, but I most certainly wasn't as brave as Charles Yates, okay, who was the brother of a friend of mine who became a priest in the UK. He was a head boy of Hilton College. He went to jail for being an objector. Had, I think, 3 tough years.
3 years, yeah.
Yeah. And,
I remember that.
A whole lot of us, we were committed, but we weren't that brave, And we all went overseas, and there were literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of us in London, of various political hues, but all people who didn't want to go to the army, and we discussed filling a jumbo jet and flying back to Jan Smuts Airport, as it was then known, and saying, right, we're all back, arrest us all, 480 of us or 430 of us, whatever the jumbo jet carried, but we never ever sort of did that. We never took that route,
Yeah. Just on that, when I was in the army, that was that rule. You either do 2 years or you go 3 years to jail. Yeah. And I don't know how it happened, but the guys, we're doing junior leaders together, and 2 of the guys slipped out, and I don't know, they got caught somewhere in a club or nightclub or bar or something, and I don't know, somehow they ended up in jail.
Yeah.
And they were there for 2 days, and they came back, obviously. And I just remember, and these were guys I always thought was very tough. They came out of Joburg, had a hard life, and they just said to us, they said, I tell you what, if you think army is tough, you don't want to go to jail.
No.
That is so tough. And that always stuck with me, and it's probably a good a good reminder for me, you know, that if those guys say that, then I definitely don't want to go
Ben,
there. So
I'll tell
I
you,
do take my hat off for
I
a guy
went to a few
making that
jails in my
decision.
university career, and then
Oh,
when I
really?
was a young lawyer, because we did all sorts of work, including criminal work, and they were not nice places.
No,
just and they're just dreadful, to put it frankly, just dreadful.
Yeah.
And it's a great deterrent.
Yes, certainly. Well,
So,
any case, so
yeah.
so you finished matric, and then did you study first, or did you go overseas?
No, I went.
to the
I came
UK?
to Australia as an exchange
Australia.
student.
That's what you said. Yeah,
So,
straight away, exchange student.
Yeah, and it's kind of. I was talking to my ex-wife about this with my daughter last night at dinner. When I got sent here, I arrived here on Friday the 13th of January in 1978. And I ran in Sydney, and I flew to Casino, and I got off a Fokker Friendship aeroplane. I didn't know anybody. They didn't know me. I had no FaceTime, no Facebook, no Instagram. It was really expensive to make telephone calls. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
We used to write aerograms, and you'd start big and you'd get smaller and smaller, and you'd write around the sides and in between the lines, and then you'd post it, and my parents would get it 3 weeks later, and then they would. So you never had a kind of a current, present kind of discussion about anything. Right. And then I got to doing tapes, and that's the way we kind of communicated with each other. You get a lot more in. But, it still took, a round trip of 4 to 6 weeks before you really communicated with one another. Now, youngsters sort of pick up and they go off and they're FaceTiming their parents every second evening to tell them what they're up to. So it's just very, very different world. And, good for my parents letting me go, and, good on me for, going and branching out and doing that at 18 years old. It was remarkable, and one of the best experiences of my life. Because I think it's a little like immigration, Rotary Exchange. It's rich. You're well looked after, so there's no problem with that. But you arrive with a completely clean whiteboard. Okay, you don't come with who your dad was, who your mom was, what you did at school, or you made a duck against Grey College. You've got none of that history. You can kind of form friendships and develop it, and you've got a year there. And I developed really, really deep relationships in that year. It was, quite a number of which persist to this day.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
I when I finished university, I went overseas for a few years and played rugby. But I found the difference, and I don't know if you found it in those days, but I found, and I was relatively young as well, I found the difference mentally for me was that I always knew that's just temporary. I'm basically there for a while and I'll go back. And that kind of, I think even at an older age in my life when I actually immigrated, that's a bit of a mental shift from knowing this is permanent and this is now it, I don't know how you experience it, but it's just something I found.
I never really thought about it like that. But I think, one of the differences for South Africans who immigrated, particularly during apartheid, and I left in 94, okay? So apartheid was over officially at that stage. The elections hadn't been held yet, but apartheid was over. But I think people who left during apartheid, they call themselves ex-South Africans, which is something which really riles me up. I get very grumpy about it. I was born in Bloemfontein. I'm a South African. I could never eschew that. It's a fact, and that's it. And I love South Africa very much. I care for it. But I don't call myself an ex-South African. I happen to be a South African-born person who now happens to be an Australian as well. And I think the richness of having both of those is a lovely and. I'm not really a very either-or kind of person. I'm an and kind of person. And I think having them both is wonderful. Both my daughters have South African passports. They're very simpatico, South Africa. They love going there. We've got a place in South Africa. So, for me, I left. And I think during apartheid, people left and they knew they couldn't go back. They'd never had that option and that alternative. I think these days it's more flexible.
Yep.
And I think there's less shame or schaamte, to put it that way, about people going back. I think when people left during apartheid, you were sort of labelled a chicken and a farrier and a runaway and all those sorts of things, which made it, increasingly difficult for people to go back because you'd taken a severe pounding from family, friends, colleagues, acquaintances, and everybody else. Yeah. That is just the way it kind of was.
Yeah.
Where were you with your rugby?
I went over to France, played a year there, played a year in Germany. And then I went over to the States for a little while as well. Yes, early 90s. Yeah, that's right. So I was actually in 94 when we voted. I was actually in Sydney, and we voted in Sydney there at
Is that right?
at the offices. Yeah, of course.
Where, Chatswood?
No, it was. I can't remember. It was in the middle of the city. It must have been in the middle of the city because they took us there because we won a rugby tour, and so the whole rugby team
nice.
Team went there, and we all voted from there.
Amazing. Yeah, I had a few friends who played rugby in France around that time. We'll have to talk about that separately.
Yeah.
Right. So, exchange student, that was for a year, was that right?
It was.
78. And then after that?
Yeah. Then I went to Pietermaritzburg University.
Okay.
I enrolled to do a BA, and I did, surprise, political science.
Yeah.
And I did psychology and geography were my sort of three main subjects that I liked. I sort of toyed with the idea of becoming a clinical psychologist, and a little bit like the story about going to prisons, I spent a bit of time in mental hospitals in Pietermaritzburg with some of the lecturers there. There's a guy, Graham Hayes, who I remember well, who had a huge influence on me. And he was a great thinker and a Freudian-oriented psychologist and thinker. Okay. And I was quite taken by the whole clinical psychology thing, I must say. But after a number of visits, and I went a lot to the mental hospitals, I went, wow, this is really, really exacting profession to go into. And that's when I kind of reverted back to being a lawyer, which most probably suited me better. I was better arguing and talking than listening to people's problems. So, a bit of self-reflection in that, I suspect.
Correct.
Self-awareness.
When you were in Sydney that year, did you ever dawn on you, or did you ever think you'll come back and live here and make a life?
I always wanted, my parents always spoke about us perhaps making a home elsewhere. My brother went to Texas, to Bernie near Houston, and he loved that. We then sat down ultimately as a family. My parents are retired. They moved to Natal, to Kloof, and we sat down as a family. We made a decision. I came back with my mother in the late 80s. So sorry, early 80s, my apologies, and showed her around, and my father had the view if my mother liked it, then that would be fine. And we then made a decision as a family to apply. My brother came first with Deloitte, I'm the eldest, he's just younger than me. And then the family came as a unit, and then my eldest sister came, and I came last because I couldn't get in because I was a lawyer. I didn't have enough points. And I only got in because I got the 5 or 10 points, whatever, as the sole surviving direct member of the family who wasn't in Australia yet, and I was the cause of it all. So, and I came in, in a way, and we'll get onto this later. I think because Anton did mention in the early pieces, I almost stayed in South Africa. Okay, after I'd come back, in the late 80s, early 90s, and lived through that whole sort of tumultuous period.
Yeah, that's a really interesting piece, I think, that we want to talk about. So you finished Pietermaritzburg, and then, of course, you were very active as a student politically then with New South and so on, and then after you then do LLB. So that was a 4-year story, right?
Well, in total, it took me 6 years because I did a pure BA and then I did an LLB. Right. So I didn't co-mix my legals into the BA. I was involved in sport. I played university hockey, cricket. I was involved in student politics. I was the RAG chairman. I was then the orientation committee chairman twice, and I was on the SRC, and then I was SRC president and on the New South executive. Right. And I was involved in politics. I mean, to understand my politics, I'm a John Stuart Mill liberal, and I'm the greatest good for the greatest number kind of liberal, right? I'm nothing more than that. And I think in the context of South Africa, people like me were seen as communists. I was never a communist. I flirted with socialism as a political science student at university. And when I studied Karl Marx, for example, we had to go to the university library, we had to sign a register, we had to go into this locked room, which was secured, and we used to read Das Kapital, and learn about Karl Marx, and we weren't allowed to make notes. We weren't allowed to remove the book from the room, and then we signed out again. And then the security police would come and check the register every number of months at the library at Pietermaritzburg University. I mean, it was just extraordinary. And then we'd write exams on it. and we'd then transfer what was in our brains onto a bit of paper, which was out in the open. It was all rather bizarre stuff, you know.
Well, it all depends on how much you concentrated when you read it. Though.
Yeah.
Well,
You
I
could
was
write your
very
own
bad.
story, you know.
All
You
that
could have rewritten
dialectical
the book.
stuff I was very bad at.
But it was interesting that you say that, you know, my experience, because as I said to you, I spoke earlier about how I grew up and the kind of family I did, and then went to the army, and then, you know, in some of the other podcasts we talked about that period, and that changed me quite a bit, Mark, in terms of who I am and who I was with at the time. And then when I went to university, I went to Pretoria, and then after that, all I wanted to do, and it probably came from the army time, I spent my time with the Bushmen. And so the only thing I wanted to do when I started working, because I did industrial psychology, was that I wanted to work with trade unions. I wanted to negotiate. I wanted to do that sort of thing. And I ended up in automotive company in Pretoria. It was then called Samcor. Just before the Ford days. It was part of Ford. And then, of course, I got involved quite a bit with unions. And I was obviously on the management side because I was a labor relations officer. But I spent my time in the union offices a lot. And I learned so much about South Africa and socialism and communism and all that sort of stuff, and how they saw the world. And you got an appreciation why it was like that. You know, standing on the outside looking in, you know, it was easy to criticize, but standing inside there in a factory, there's 4,000 or 5,000 people. All of them have a really daunting task just to get to work and back, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And how hard that was, and then the unions, and then how you learn all of that and build the relationships with them, and because that, you know, because it was part of the Ford Motor Company that you mentioned earlier, that was where the Sullivan Principles was also, you know, we ascribed to that.
Yes.
And so because of that, you know, the labor relations were very progressive. But that didn't spare us from all the wildcat strikes anyway, because that was where the fighting went on, was in the factories and in the schools at the time.
Well, it was basically political, wasn't it? It wasn't about economics or business or workers' rights. Those were really a proxy for the more important political kind of debate.
Yeah,
you know,
and
that's the way it was.
And it was a really interesting time and a very formative one. It came at a good time in my career because it was really at the start, and there was no better way to school yourself to the future of South Africa than in the trade union movement, working with them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I did a lot politically with trade union oriented people and people who were socialists or communists, and Bram Fischer was, you know, there's a great book written on him, was, you know, the first Afrikaner communist, by Seligman, if I remember the name of the author correctly. I think I've got that wrong, but you know, it was there. But I've always believed the rights of the individual surmount the rights of the collective, and I think that's, if I look at the base of the difference in my political views compared to people who are more collectively oriented, is that very point. It kind of goes no further than that, kind of, in a sense. You got to side by side of the kind of ledger you're on that point. But you know, I had a great sympathy for the work that they did and the efforts that they did. And a friend of mine who ended up on the Supreme Court of Appeal recently retired, Judge Clive Plaskett. He was at Cheadle Thompson Haysom. You know, those Nick Haysom was Mandela's lawyer. They did a lot of work for unions. You know, sort of Cyril Ramaphosa was very sort of prominent as a client when he was involved in COSATU and all of that. And of course, I understood, you know, the political dimensions, and, you know, frankly, I had a lot of sympathy for what they were doing around that. But when it got to what would the new South Africa be like, the individual rights and that small L liberal piece kind of comes through strongly for me, which is different from a lot. I don't admire people like Castro or Gaddafi. I don't admire those people. I don't think they are great humans. I think Bishop Tutu is a superb human being and dealt with him, you know, a lot.
Great man.
I thought Mahatma Gandhi was an outstanding human being. I thought Martin Luther King was an outstanding human being. I thought Nelson Mandela was. But those other people were sort of more roguey to me, and I wouldn't fall in line with that kind of adoration, because I believed in the rights of the individual and you know, the democracy that comes with that.
That's right.
You know?
And it was, you know, a very similar experience for me in that sense, working with the unions, because you had people in the unions were there. It was funny, as they got more rights during that time, of course, there were some of them that became far more entitled. And then that became a real issue in the end, and they drifted away from their membership. And then there were the ones that were really, that knew why they were there in the first place. So maybe at this point, Mark, I mean, we've covered quite a bit. We've covered to the point where you let's say maybe finished university, and then what I want to do is perhaps end this episode at this point, and then what we want to do is to then have a chat to you in our next installment, or our next episode, is to talk about the period from there. There were some big decisions that you made, informed from whether you needed to stay in South Africa or not. There was we certainly want to talk about the Muhammad Ali tour, which was during that time before you left South Africa, and so we want to cover some of that stuff. And then I think Ben and I would be very interested to hear more about you and how you settled into Australia and your experience of that, because when we talk to people, that's very interesting. Is that about
absolutely
where we are, Ben?
Mark, I can only say thanks. It's fantastic talking to you. I can't believe we've been on this. It feels like 10 minutes. It's really good to hear your story. So looking forward to the next episode.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.